Whilst the gameplay that you're about to see is from a story mission that also features a boss, you won't see gameplay of the boss fight and there will be no major story spoilers. Now then guys, the final Vault Hunter to show off is AMON, so we're going to go over all of his abilities, his traits, his augments and capstones, showing off all of the different ways that his kit can essentially be changed. This features a campaign mission in the background, Rush the Gate, which is in this certain area, and so I sort of played through the game, got to level 30 to show off some of the capstones, and then used this mission to show it off. These videos are a lot of work, and especially for AMON, because he has such long cooldowns on a majority of his kit, this was a kind of miserable video to be making to get all of the gameplay. So if you enjoy it, it would mean a lot if you'd like to subscribe, watch the other videos for the other Vault Hunters, and if you have any questions about the game whilst I've got an early copy, whilst I can't answer them right now, put them in the comments and I'll be sure to answer them in the future. But let's get started. So AMON's trait is a little bit more straightforward in the sense that it's just called Forge Skill, and instead of having one action skill per talent tree, he gets two. So the first one to go over as we go into the Calamity Red tree is Onslaughter, where you overload your Forge Fist, which gives you constant shield regeneration, bonus incendiary damage with guns, and increased movement speed just whilst this duration is active. You can also press the action skill button again or press the melee button to rocket punch, dash into targeted enemies, dealing melee damage incendiary style in a short ranged cone and causing an effect called stagger. Bosses can't be staggered and badasses have a chance to be staggered. The punch locks in from a good amount of distance, and it's very similar to the capstone that Amara had in her brawl tree. But like I said, Forge Skill means that he gets two abilities in his tree, and the second one is Molten Slam, where you press and hold the action skill button to slam a Molten Forge Hammer into the ground, dealing incendiary melee damage to enemies in a large area. And the cooldowns are long for both abilities actually, 50 seconds for the main Onslaughter one. But moving on to the augments, the first one is Pyroclast in this tree. Whenever Onslaughter is activated, AMON fully restores his health and shield and is surrounded by a Forge Storm that deals incendiary status effect damage to nearby enemies over time. Whenever you get a kill, it restores AMON's action skill duration, and it also increases the damage, and it doesn't seem to stack, which is really cool. The second augment is Thermal Diffusion. Rocket Punch now has two modes and gains increased radius that deals bonus damage based on AMON's maximum shield capacity, 20% of which is going to be turned into bonus damage. And this is where it gets cool. If you press the action skill button again to melee, it will do incendiary melee damage. However, if you press the melee button, which also still does this Rocket Punch, instead of it being exactly the same, it's going to do cryo melee damage instead. So it's almost similar to the cybernetics tree with the two axes that you can throw. You can actually do different types of elemental melee damage, which is really fun. Bottom left augment is Fell Frost, where pressing F immediately after you rocket punch causes AMON to use a follow-up attack, dealing cryo melee damage in a large area in front of you. I mean, the window from actually going from the rocket punch to using this follow-up attack is quite large anyway, but it also executes non-boss enemies that have less than 25% total HP. They're instantly killed. Next up is Force of Nature. Whenever Onslaughter is active, gun damage dealt to enemies will prime them for a duration and will detonate when they die or they're damaged by a Forge skill, dealing incendiary damage to nearby enemies. Detonations can also be caused by melee attack damage, but it deals less damage than using a Forge skill. This kind of augment and talent does come up quite a lot in other trees, where you prime an enemy with an elemental effect, and if you want to explode them, you either kill the enemy or you use a Forge skill on them to bait. It's kind of like Anthem actually, like the whole priming and then detonating certain elemental effects. But in this case, you could do it with a Forge skill and also a melee attack. And then we have Fulminating Fist. AMON gains increased status effect chance whilst Onslaughter is active. And if you press F instead of doing the rocket punch, you do a concentrated lightning wave that deals shock melee damage to enemies that it passes through. So more of a ranged attack than your Doomfist jumping around and punching everything. So the augments change up a lot on how this main ability works with Onslaughter, but the capstones tend to work more towards the Forge skills and Molten Slam. So the first one is Hawkcleave. Molten Slam is now Hawkcleave, and you press and hold to swing a massive Forge Axe, launching a Forge Wave that deals cryo melee damage and freezes enemies that it passes through. Enemies killed by Hawkcleave cause a detonation, dealing cryo damage. Which, yeah, this is pretty much it. This is kind of the problem with a lot of the AMON gameplay, is just, I get to see it once, and then you have to wait a minute to see it again, so it's pretty much going to be that on replay. The middle capstone is Molten Royal, where the Molten Slam now gains increased radius and stores damage, and you see these little pyres erupting under up to 3 enemies after a delay. These pyres deal additional incendiary melee damage based on damage stored by Molten Slam and distributed among the remaining targets. Yet again, it's like, this is it. This is pretty much it. That's all there is to show, so let's move on. And finally we have Stormcutter, where Molten Slam is now Stormcutter, where you press and hold F to swing a massive forge sword, launching a forge wave that deals shock melee damage to all enemies that it passes through. It also restores action skill cooldown, action skill duration, and ordnance cooldown for each enemy hit. So this is more just like a tool than a big slam ability. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Going over to the Vengeance tree, we have Scourge, which I did like a lot. AMON equips a Forge Shield as the main ability, and it absorbs all frontal damage as Vengeance. Whenever the Vengeance meter, you'll see in the bottom left over the ability icon, when that meter is filled, Forge Shield provides damage reduction instead, and Vengeance drains rapidly if it's not been gained recently. The other part of this ability is the Forge Wave, where if you press F whilst the action skill is active, you send out these Forge Waves, dealing cryo ordnance damage to enemies that it passes through, and it consumes Vengeance to increase the damage dealt. What I initially thought with this is that it was like charges of how many times that you can use a Forge Wave, but no, you could literally just spam this ability like crazy if you want. Vengeance only just increases the damage. You don't even need to have to shield up if you just want to keep yeeting out these cryo ordnance whips. But the cooldown is 70 seconds, and the duration is 18, but there's ways to upgrade it. The Forge skill is Firewall, where if you press and hold the action skill, you deploy a firewall that absorbs enemy projectiles. It also grants friendly projectiles that pass through it increased damage and projectile speed, and absorbed damage that goes into the firewall is converted into Vengeance that you can use for your Forge Waves, while Scourge is active at least. Enemies that are near the firewall will take fire damage over time. You can basically walk through this as well. TDR guns don't go through this for some reason. I think that's a bit of an oversight, really. But yeah, this is kind of like Baptiste's Wall from Overwatch. And yet again, the cooldown is outrageous, so it's not really that fun to play around. And in a similar vein, the augments tend to focus on what the main action skill is with Scourge, and we start with Blast Chill, where the Forge Waves that you send out now consume more Vengeance and explode on impact, dealing cryo ordnance damage in an area instead of just passing through. The explosion radius is further increased if the Forge Wave passes through a firewall. I wanted to show this off, but again, I'm like waiting a minute to show off every single interaction, and some of these abilities' durations aren't very long, so I kind of hit my limit with trying to get some of the stuff here, as you can imagine. So yeah, this is a nice one, just hard to show. Cryonic Thrum is the second augment in the main branch of this tree. While Scourge is active, AMON taunts enemies and sends out a cryonic pulse every second, dealing cryo ordnance damage to enemies and restoring allies' health. When AMON's movement speed is reduced, but you'll see that AMON gains bonus cryo damage with guns, and it also consumes Vengeance on each gunshot too, which I like. I like when the abilities go into like doing gun damage, similar to what HARLOWE has. The next augment is Molten Rebuke. Forge Wave is now Molten Rebuke instead of just being the sort of cryo whip. You can press F to consume all Vengeance and throw the Forge Shield at target enemies, dealing fire ordnance damage, and it ricochets on impact. It also ricochets additional times based on how much Vengeance was consumed. Whenever the Forge Shield is thrown, you don't get that damage absorption from the shield protecting you naturally because you've sent it out. And again, you could sort of throw this out multiple times. It's just a case of like Vengeance allows it to ricochet to more enemies if you want it to. Middle augment is Eternal Winter. Forge Waves now partially restore action skill duration and firewall duration on damaging enemies and can be activated 3 times in succession. The third activation launches a massive Forge Wave that deals increased damage and doesn't consume any form of Vengeance. I like this one. You probably saw it at the start of this video of just spamming it out, just keeping the duration going. This felt like good to use because it was just like this uptime game and you're just spamming people with cryo damage if you build around it. Yeah, seems like that's a good thing to make. The last augment I also liked, which was Stormlance, where Forge Wave is now Stormlance and you throw a Forge Spear instead of the whip, dealing shock ordnance damage on impact and consuming Vengeance to increase the damage dealt. And similar to one of the augments in the other tree, enemies that are damaged by the Forge Spear are primed for a duration and will detonate when they are damaged by a Forge skill, which is hard to do because of the shield. Or you can actually detonate it by doing gun critical hit damage instead of a melee, and it deals shock damage to the target but none to nearby enemies. So it's more of a focus on one person kind of ability. Now we get onto the capstones, and much like the last tree, it tends to change up how the forge skill works, which is Firewall. It now becomes Ring of Frostfire, which was actually really hard for me to say just then. Firewall is now a ring that deals incendiary damage to enemies inside of it, and cryo damage to enemies who enter or leave. Firewall grants friendly projectiles that pass through it further increased damage and projectile speed, so it's still the same wall, but now it's just in this kind of ring. And the cooldown is still a minute. Middle capstone is Glacial Rapture. Firewall is now this new ability where if you press and hold, you swing these 2 Forge Whips, dealing cryo ordnance damage over 2 hits to enemies before slamming into the ground, creating this fissure that deals cryo ordnance damage and leaves cryo hazards for a duration. There's 70-second cooldown. And then Wrathfall, where instead of the Firewall, you now press and hold F to call down a massive Forge Sword to strike a target enemy, dealing shock ordnance damage to enemies in that area, and it always critically hits. I thought it was more of like a stays in one place and does damage, but it is just kind of like a one hit, and it's a 45-second cooldown. Finally, we have the Cybernetics tree, and we have Crucible as the main action skill. Where it's a charge skill, you get these Forge Axes that can be thrown and picked off the ground, which can be then used to refund this cooldown. Once you press the action skill, you'll have the option to left click or right click, and it will give you a different element of Flame Axe or Frost Axe at base level. Enemies that are damaged by the axes are primed, much like some of the augments we went over. They've got this effect on them, and they will detonate when they die or when they're damaged by the Forge skill, which deals damage to nearby enemies. Some of these specify that they deal AoE damage, some of them specify that they just focus on one, but in this case it does have this explosive effect. You can throw out all 3 at once, it doesn't matter, you don't need to have a set amount at any given time. And you get 50% of the cooldown, which is 18 seconds, so you shave off 9 seconds every time you pick it up, but if you hit an enemy with it, there's no chance for you to pick it up. It's only when it hits the ground. And the Forge skill is Double Edge. You press and hold the action skill to throw a twinned Forge Axe, dealing cryo melee damage to enemies it passes through, and then it returns to AMON, dealing fire damage on the way back. And you guessed it, augments are more for the action skill, capstones are more for the Forge skill. And the first augment is Axe and Stone. AMON gains increased movement speed for a duration after damaging an enemy with a Forge Axe, and can detonate primed enemies with a melee attack now, which is cool. Also, detonating certain primed effects gives you different rewards, different buffs. If you detonate a Flame Axe, it restores action skill cooldown, and if you detonate a Cryo Axe, it restores ordnance cooldown. Endless War is next to it. Primed enemies take increased gun damage for each stack of prime. If AMON detonates a primed enemy, a new Forge Axe is spawned that seeks out nearby enemies. It's kind of hard to see from the gameplay, it does appear. But yeah, another augment that I kind of like. However, as you get further into the tree, you get some augments that change up actually what element your weapons are. Instead of having your Forge Axes with Hour of the Hammer, you can change them to Forge Hammers, dealing frost or shock damage instead of fire. Enemies damaged by the hammers are primed, and they will detonate and they will deal damage to nearby enemies. So you can throw a Cryo Hammer or a Shock Hammer, you don't have the option for fire. My problem with this is, like, we just went over 2 really cool augments, and if now I want to change what element my weapons are, which you kind of need to do at high difficulties, you now just have to go for this and you don't get to do the cool stuff. If this was like Zane, where you could have 2 augments, it would be a lot better, but yeah, I have more to say about that. But Blade Tempest is the middle augment, and it's pretty much the same. Instead of axes or hammers, you now have Forge Swords, and instead of having Cryo, you choose Flame or Shock with your weapons, and it consumes all of the charges that you have as well when activated to launch a barrage of Forge Swords at the enemy too. Enemies damaged are primed, but when it detonates, it will explode and do damage to the target, but none to nearby enemies. And it's a left click for a Flame Sword and right click for a Shock Sword. And the right hand side augment is Searing Cold, where the Frost Axes instantly freeze enemies on impact, including badasses, big enemies, even on higher difficulties where elements matter more, you can still instantly freeze them, and Flame Axes now pass through enemies too. And Capstones, pretty much almost exclusively working on Double Edge. The first one is Snow Mold, where this weapon that you throw out, the double-edged sword, when you press and hold, you throw out a twinned Forge Hammer instead, which deals cryo melee damage to nearby enemies, and it also ricochets between enemies up to 3 times. If there's no ricochets available, it will just deal extended damage before destroying itself on that one target. For each detonation caused, it ricochets an additional time. So if you prime people and then use this Forge skill to detonate, there's going to be a lot of ricochets. Middle capstone is Storm Surge. Double-edged is now Storm Surge, where you press and hold F to throw a twinned Forge Blade, dealing shock melee damage in an area on impact. It basically creates an AoE Forge Storm that does this shock status effect damage over time. The duration is 18 seconds, and the cooldown is 35 seconds. It's not as bad as some of the other trees, but I thought that there might be a way to potentially pick this up and move it, but it doesn't seem to be the case. And the final capstone is Conflangerang, where Double Edge now deals melee damage in both directions instead of cryo on the way there, and it also gains increased radius and leaves a trail of fire as it travels. If it's close enough to the ground, it will leave this trail and it will do fire damage as a hazard. If you cause a detonation with this Forge skill or you damage an enemy, it will restore the Forge skill cooldown. So this you can actually, if you prime enemies and then throw it out and you hit multiple, you can actually have a really reduced cooldown on this one, which is kind of cool. But yeah, not only is that all of the action skill augments and capstones for AMON, but that's all of the characters covered as well. So be sure to check out the other videos if you want. Certainly after this one, I think like if I did AMON first, I would hate doing the other three. So I'm glad that I left this one till last. But now I feel like I can actually play the game a little bit more. But be sure to like and subscribe. Can't talk about much else at the moment, but I do want to do my Choose Your Vault Hunter big video on what people should do and yeah, give my opinions on what I've played so far. Well, thank you for all of the support. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!